You are 18 years old, and it is a Tuesday in March, and you are walking to the schoolhouse in Compiègne with a hairbrush in your coat pocket that isn't really a hairbrush. The morning is cold, the way early spring mornings are cold in this part of France. Not brutal, just persistent, the kind of cold that gets into your knuckles and stays there until noon. You pass the boulangerie, closed today because there's no flour, and the baker standing in the doorway anyway, out of habit more than hope. You pass 2 German soldiers smoking outside the requisitioned hotel on Rue des Lombards. You nod. They don't look at you. You are, by design, not worth looking at. Your name doesn't matter here. Not because it isn't important, but because for the next year, you will answer to 3 different ones. And the girl walking to the schoolhouse this morning, Marie-Claire, the assistant teacher's aide, quiet, unremarkable, good with children, is only one of them. 6 months ago, you were just a farmer's daughter from the outskirts of town, the third of 4 children, known mostly for being fast on a bicycle and for beating every boy in the village at cards. Your father grew sugar beets on land. His father had worked before him. Your mother kept the house and complained, lovingly, about the mud you tracked in. You had a boy, Henri, who worked at his uncle's garage and who you were going to marry. Someday, once the war ended and things went back to being simple, then the Germans came through Compiègne in earnest, and simple stopped being something you could count on. Élodie Fontaine changed everything. You'd known her since you were both 6 years old, catching frogs in the same drainage ditch, and when she came to you in the fall with a folded piece of paper and a question in her eyes instead of on her lips, you didn't ask what it meant before you said yes. That's the truth about the beginning of most brave things. You agree before you understand what you're agreeing to. The letter you carried that first time was nothing. A grocery list, maybe, for all you knew. But the way Élodie's hand shook when she pressed it into yours told you it wasn't nothing at all. By winter, you were doing this every week. Messages folded into the lining of coats, names memorized and never written down, a whole second language of who to trust and who to smile at and keep walking. The hairbrush came from Lucien. Everyone in the network called him grand-père, though he was only 53 old. In a war run mostly by teenagers and men too broken by the last war to fight this one with rifles. He had a woodworking shop that smelled of linseed oil and sawdust, and one evening in November he handed you a plain wooden hairbrush, the bristles slightly uneven, nothing special to look at. "Turn the handle," he said. You did, and it came apart at a seam so fine you hadn't seen it, revealing a hollow no bigger than your thumb. "For the messages that are too dangerous to fold," he said, "carry it like it's yours. Brush your hair with it if anyone's watching. Objects that get used don't get searched." You didn't think much of it then. It was a tool, like the bicycle, like the false papers folded into your shoe. You didn't know yet that it would still be in your pocket when everything else was gone. The winter deepened, and so did the work. Your companion in this, the closest thing you had to a partner, though the network kept people compartmentalized on purpose, was Élodie. She was braver than you in the ways that mattered, and more frightened than you in the ways nobody saw. She had a laugh that carried too far for someone doing what she did, and Lucien scolded her for it more than once. And she'd apologize, and then laugh again 10 minutes later, because that was who she was, and asking her to stop laughing was like asking her to stop breathing. She talked about her older brother, taken to Germany for forced labor 18 months back, letters growing thinner and less frequent until they stopped. She talked about wanting, after all this, to open a dress shop in Paris, something with her name on the window in gold letters. Small dreams, the kind that felt almost embarrassing to admit out loud in a world falling apart, which is exactly why she admitted them to you and almost no one else. Lucien gave you the only rule that mattered, delivered once, in December, in the back room of his shop with sawdust on the floor and a single candle burning low. The war doesn't ask permission to end you, it just does. So do the thing today. Don't save the courage for tomorrow. Tomorrow isn't a promise anyone's making you. You didn't understand it fully then. You would understand it completely, later, in ways you wished you didn't have to. By February, the checkpoints had tightened. German patrols stopped being predictable, which meant the easy routes stopped being safe. You started memorizing back alleys, timing patrols by the church bell, learning which guards were tired enough at the end of their shift to wave you through without looking twice. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being watched, or from believing you might be watched. Every hour of every day, a tightness behind the eyes that never fully releases, even in sleep. You carried that tightness through January and February the way you carried the hairbrush. Without complaint, because complaining wasn't a luxury the network could afford. If you've stayed with this story this far, it's worth pausing here. Not for a message, but for the same reason Lucien gave you his rule. Some stories only survive because someone decided, quietly, that they were worth carrying forward. This is one of them. The message that changed everything arrived on the 9th of March. Lucien needed someone to carry word to a safe house near the transit camp on the edge of town, the one everyone in Compiègne knew about, and no one spoke of directly, the camp where prisoners were held before being put on trains east. A resistance member had been arrested 2 days prior, and there was a real fear he'd talk, which meant 3 safe houses needed to be emptied before nightfall. Elodie volunteered for the northern route. You took the eastern one. You didn't know, when you split at the corner of Rue Saint-Corneille, that it would be the last time you saw her walking. The eastern route took you past the camp's outer perimeter, close enough to see the watchtowers, close enough to hear, faintly, the particular silence that surrounds a place like that. Not an absence of sound, but a wrongness in it, the way a room feels wrong when someone has just stopped screaming. You kept walking. You kept your pace even. You thought about Henri's garage, about the smell of motor oil, about anything except the fence and the towers and the low grey buildings behind them, because thinking about them too directly made your hands shake, and shaking hands got noticed. A checkpoint stopped you 2 streets from the safe house. A young German soldier, barely older than you, asked for your papers. You handed them over. He studied your face, then the photograph, then your face again, too long, longer than the routine required. "You're out early," he said, in French rough enough that you could tell he was translating in his head. "I teach the little ones," you said. "Before class I walk. It clears my thoughts." He handed the papers back. Something in his face, not suspicion exactly, more like tiredness recognizing itself, made him wave you on without further questions. You'd learn later that not everyone who stopped you that week was so tired, or so young, or so willing to let a girl with a hairbrush in a pocket walk on by. You reached the safe house, you delivered the message. The family inside, a mother, 2 children, a grandfather too frail to move quickly, left within the hour, scattering to relatives in the countryside, and you never learned if they made it or where they ended up, because that was the nature of the work. You did your part, and then the story continued somewhere you couldn't follow it. It was 2 days later that you learned about Elodie. Her northern route had run through a section of town where a different network cell had been compromised that same morning. Information neither of you had, because compartmentalization meant nobody in your position knew everything, by design, so that if one person was caught, they couldn't give away the rest. A routine patrol became a search. The search became an arrest. 12 people were taken that morning, and Elodie Fontaine was one of them. You didn't see it happen. You heard about it the way you heard about most things in the network. Secondhand, through a coded phrase passed at the market, delivered so flatly, it took you a full minute to understand what had actually been said. She'd been taken to the transit camp on the edge of town, the one you'd walked past 2 days before, thinking about motor oil to keep your hands from shaking. 3 weeks later, a name appeared on a list smuggled out by a sympathetic clerk. Prisoners transported east, to a camp further into occupied territory. Her name was on it. That was the last confirmed information anyone in the network ever received about Elodie Fontaine. No further letters, no further lists. Just a name, and then, eventually, silence where a name used to be. There was no funeral. There was no body to bury, no grave to visit, no ceremony to mark what had happened to a girl who used to laugh too loud in rooms where laughing was dangerous. There was only the absence of her, sitting in every room you'd once shared, the way absence does. Not loud, not dramatic, just permanently and quietly there. Lucien lasted 6 more weeks. You don't know the details of his arrest. Not really, only that his workshop was empty one morning. The linseed oil smell still hanging in the air, the tools left exactly where he'd set them down mid-task, as though he'd simply stepped out and meant to come back. Someone in the network told you, months later, that he'd been executed at a camp outside Paris, though even that came second-hand, filtered through 3 people who each heard it from someone else. You never got confirmation you could call certain. You learned, that spring, That certainty was a thing the war had mostly stopped handing out. There was a moment, near the end of that same spring, that you've never fully told anyone about. Not your family, not Henri, not the interviewers who came around decades later asking veterans and resistance members to record their memories before there was no one left to ask. You were delivering a message near the camp perimeter again, and you saw, through a gap in the fence, a German guard, young, exhausted, maybe 20, holding a photograph he'd pulled from his coat, looking at it the way you looked at photographs of Henri. You didn't know who was in the photograph, a wife, a mother, a child, maybe. You've never known, and you've spent decades wondering whether that not knowing was a mercy or a theft. That's the part of the story that doesn't resolve. That's the part historians and documentary makers tend to leave out, because it doesn't serve a clean narrative of good and evil. The fact that the war made almost everyone, on every side, into someone carrying a photograph they were afraid to lose. You carried the hairbrush the rest of that year, and into the next, until the Allies came through in the late summer of 1944. And Compiègne, at last, stopped being occupied. You kept doing the work, until there was no more work of that kind to do. You went home to your father's farm. You saw Henri again, and eventually you married him, and eventually there was a dress shop in Paris after all. Not Elodie's, but one you opened partly in her name. Though you never told the other shopkeepers why. The town looks almost the same now as it did then. The boulangerie reopened decades ago. The hotel the Germans requisitioned is an apartment building. Children walk to school along the same streets you once walked with folded messages sewn into your coat, and none of them know it, and there's no reason they should. You still have the hairbrush. It sits in a drawer in your bedroom, the seam nearly invisible unless you know exactly where to look. The way it was always meant to be. You don't open it anymore. There's nothing inside it now, hasn't been for 80 years, but you keep it anyway, because some objects stop being tools and become something closer to a grave marker for a person who never got one. Every March, on the 9th, you walk the eastern route one more time, past the corner where you split from LOD for the last time, past the place where the camp's fence used to stand before the buildings were torn down and replaced with something ordinary. You don't know why you still do it. You've never been able to explain it, even to yourself. Maybe it's this. Someone has to remember the exact shape of the ordinary day before everything changed. Because the people who lived it are almost gone now, and once they're gone, all that's left is the version written in books. Accurate, maybe, but missing the particular cold of a March morning, the smell of a closed boulangerie, the sound of a friend's laugh that carried too far for someone doing what she did. If this story reached you today, it's because someone, somewhere, decided it was worth the risk of remembering out loud. That's what the hairbrush was always for. Not the messages. The remembering. Elodie Fontaine never opened her dress shop. Her name is on a small brass plaque in the town of Compiègne today, one name among many, easy to miss if you don't know to look for it. You know to look for it.